So we're going to talk about machine learning today, and a lot of times machine learning and AI has become as much of a marketing term as a statistical term. So we're going to get into some of the case studies, real case studies behind some examples behind this. Just as a quick disclaimer, I am the CEO and founder of Sparta, so a lot of the examples we're going to use involve Sparta, mostly because it's the most data we have access to is our data. So a lot of these examples are just more behind principles of what machine learning can look like. When we talk about health and performance, what we're really talking about is musculoskeletal injuries. Muscles, bones, joints, ligaments, because some of the others get a lot of press, but the most common injury, the most common diagnosis in the human population is musculoskeletal. So when we talk about health, that's really what we're going to talk about. Some of the challenges right now that exist in technology is a lot of these screens for musculoskeletal, a lot of them are unreliable. They're subjective. And so it's hard to define thresholds of when you're going to take action. The other piece is it practical? Because if we're doing testing once a year, the assumption then is the body's only changing once a year, which that would be nice, but it's not really the case. The other challenge is vague solutions. And so if I blew out my ACL and one of you hurt your hamstring, the chances are we would both get 20 minutes on the bike as an initial training program during that rehab process. So it tends to be very vague. And then lastly, one of the challenges is with all of this, we want to know how it rolls up into an ROI, a return on investment. And with the advance of science and technology and software, one of the challenges is these areas of being digital and being scientific, they get a little blurry. And so we're going to take a look at a normal test that's done, but done on a force plate, because this is a way to add big data to things that are already in progress. So this is a vertical jump. This is on a force plate, which gathers 1,000 points a second in 3 different planes. And so that kind of information produces thousands and thousands of data points, particularly for each trial. But then we're faced with the challenge of not everybody's the same. Particularly when we talk about sports. These are force time curves. And when we talk about a baseball team like the Rockies, pitchers don't have to react. So they've got this nice and long force curve. When you go to the Niners, football players are, in a way, always ready to hit somebody. And so you see this little chatter before, because the way they stand on the plate, they're pretty vigilant about what's going to happen next. And then we've got basketball players, when they step on a force plate, they're up in the air before you even know. So you've got all these 3 different types of populations. So how do we reduce it? How do we simplify it? In stats, the term is dimensionality reduction. And what we're really trying to do is find out of all these data points, what really matters. And what we found is that 3 variables on this force production, they account for 97% of vertical performance on this jump. 3 variables. And really, from the top down, it's how you start your force production, it's how you transition, and it's how you finish. All occurring in a jump. And this is an example of now a Dallas Cowboy. And he used to be at Notre Dame. So this is Zack Martin. And this is what a typical offensive lineman looks like. And as another disclaimer, we have permission to show every piece of case study and data we'll be presenting today. So if we look at Zack's, we see he excels at that initial force production, which if you're a quarterback, you would hope this is the case, because you want your offensive lineman to be exceptional at that initial rate of force development. And they're assigned a number based on the bell curve, based on the rest of the population, 50 being average, right in the middle of the bell curve. What we found through all the years of collecting is that when there's a difference of 15 in these T-scores, which is about 1.5 standard deviation, what we found is that there's a risk for injury. And in this case, when that initial force is higher than the rest, we see an ACL risk. The odds for an ACL are increased. The theory, we don't know for sure as to why, is that rather than bending to dissipate the force, you twist. And if you twist on a hinge joint, it doesn't work out well. It's not just the force though. The system, the software will bring in age, ethnicity, where the injury happened, how big they are, how many exposures they had. But the most important is actually the injury history. That's the biggest factor for health, whether we're talking about a patient or an athlete. Previous disease, previous injury. And so one of the reasons that's important is hopefully injuries aren't very common. And if we talk about ACLs, you have 1.5 on average per year for an NFL team. And so that means one NFL team, to get to the minimum number of samples for prediction, which is 100, an NFL team would need 63 years of their data to actually be able to predict ACLs. So they have to aggregate, much like medicine, because 63 years is probably about 20 coaching staffs in the NFL. Right over the Browns, it's probably 63. But the point is, right, it has to aggregate data across different teams in the way that hospitals aggregate data, because no one hospital has enough diabetes to use their own data. So they have to aggregate. And thankfully, these patterns are actually shared across different sports. The quantities are going to be different, but the pattern is actually very similar. Now, if we look at what's possibly the exact opposite position and requirements of an offensive lineman, we're going to look at a pitcher who has to be graceful and extend that force production over time. He gets better as it goes, because as soon as his foot leaves the rubber, he can't throw anymore. The force is done. The movement's complete. So again, we sign a number, and again, that rule of 15 or a standard deviation and a half applies, except this time, when we see this with a baseball player, there's an increased odds for a UCL, or what's known as Tommy John injury. And this is from a jump. So this is my favorite example of machine learning, because we didn't go into the system looking, okay, we're going to look for upper body injuries out of a lower body jump. That was not the approach. A lot of times it's called unsupervised machine learning, or unlabeled data gets put into the model, and you hope it works out well, and patterns start to emerge. So this is a study that was done with over 4 years with the Colorado Rockies, Stephen Hopkins, looking at 270 pitchers over 4 years, so the equivalent of 499 player seasons. Pretty large study for pro athletes. And what would happen is they took all the data and they split it in half. One is a test set, one is a training set. And a predictive model was built out of the test set. So what are the odds of injuries happening, hamstring, elbow, knee? And then that predictive model was used against the actual training model, the data that wasn't used to build that outcome. To see, okay, did what actually happen, did we actually predict it? That's how a lot of this data is validated. And it's even becoming more common in medicine. Random controlled trials are becoming more and more by the wayside. There's a lot of bias built into this. And so machine learning has allowed us to approach it in this manner. And to validate it further, we look at, okay, well, what's the true positive or the false positive rate? And this is called a receiver operating characteristic curve. Just rolls off the tongue, right? So 0.5, the dotted line, is a coin toss. So hopefully you're better than a coin toss. Hopefully you're not worse. So what we found is there's a 0.7 on this. So of all the times the model predicts an elbow, 70% of the time you're right, which is pretty good. Now, a true positive means if there is an elbow injury, can you predict it? The most dangerous part of sports science is the false positives. Coaches and staff will stop listening if everybody is at risk. Ted talked earlier about communication being one of the most challenging pieces of feedback from sports teams, and this is one of the reasons why. He's at risk, he has to go lighter, So making sure that that false positive is limited as well. So applying this back to Jon, the predictive rate is so strong that teams like the Rockies are proactively resting players. A lot of times it's called the phantom DL, phantom disabledness. So 15 days of rest is a lot better than 1 year, year and a half rehab from Tonga. Proactively resting the player, but making sure that during that rest period, things are done that's going to maximize that time. And by that, I mean behavioral changes. Most of us in this room, myself included, probably can't affect genetics very much. Right? So really focusing on what the big chunk that contributes to behavioral change, and whether you're a patient, an athlete, a soldier, those behavioral changes, that's what really affects the outcome. Now, as far as medicine goes, does anybody know what one of the best behavioral changes that's been made in medicine in the last 20 years has been? Any guesses?
Checklist.
Checklist is a big one, for sure. Specifically, medications. The XR pill, the extended release pill. So checklist is a massive, if you guys haven't read that book, Checklist Manifesto is fantastic. But the once a day pill, and this is a graph showing the rate of adherence, makes a huge difference in compliance. That extended release pill really changes and improves those behavioral changes that are made. So we approached it and said, okay, let's look at it like pharmacology. Let's classify these exercises like pharmacology does. Is it an antibiotic? Is it an analgesic? Well, is it a squat in this case? That's the pattern. What type of antibiotic is it? Or in this case, what type of squat is it? And then how is that squat given? Is it a dumbbell, barbell? In the antibiotic case, we can see it can be oral or intravenous. And so this study looked at all the types of exercises and then what the dosage of it was. How many reps, sets, how often do you do it? And in most cases, the study found that after 7 weeks, exercise effects start to wear off. There's a tolerance. So does anybody know the most effective antibiotic we can compare this to? Any guesses? Kind of know what any types further?
Amoxicillin.
Yeah, so Z-Pak, amoxicillin. Why is Z-Pak the most effective, you think?
You finish it.
Yeah, why do people finish 100%?
Because there's 5 steps, it's in a pack.
Yeah, so they've even knocked it down to 3. So it's gone from 5 to 3 steps, exactly. People finish it because it's one pill, once a day for 3 days. So how do we take a lot of these lessons from pharmacology and apply them really to prevention? And so lining up that pharmacology piece with the diagnostic piece, there's so many factors involved. We have to approach it like low back pain, because low back pain can be anything from psychological to cancer. A lot of things in between. And so looking at it the opposite way of saying, okay, what can we affect? What can we treat? This is an example of an individual on Kansas. He's playing in the NBA, and he had a high, very long, prolonged rate of force like a pitcher. But if you're 7 feet tall under the rim, taking a long time, not very helpful, right? You've got to be able to rebound quickly or put the ball back up. So Kansas changed the exercises he was given. A few months later, his force started to change. Ultimately, that same year, he won Defensive Player of the Year. So they're able to shift not only his injury and his health, but also more importantly, his overall performance. Can't really separate those two out. And so with more data, the analyses we were able to run is what's called a canonical correlation. So this looks at multiple dimensions. So what we found is that better basketball players have a lower initial force and a higher transition force. So that means they use less force to get going, and basically they slingshot out of it. It's a tighter rubber band. And by better basketball players, what I mean is these individuals played more minutes. It's the best metric there is, more minutes. Because if you're playing a bad team, a good team, if you're healthy and you play well, the coach is going to want to continue to play you over time. Now what's interesting is females are different. We've actually found that that initial force is more important for them. They've got to keep that high. The theory there is that there's an ACL or a knee prevention component to that initial force production that females need more than males. So when we talk about resilience or this minutes played better athletes, we enter this dilemma of, okay, how fast, how strong do I want to be? We use the story of Icarus as an example. We want to fly as close to the sun as we can without getting burned. And so this is where data really helps. We use the example of Zack and what an offensive lineman looks like. We also know that this is what an ACL risk looks like. So using the numbers, the T-scores, we want to fly as close to the sun as we can without getting burned. And one of the ways we do that is what's called decision trees. For a decision tree to work, maximally or optimally at least, you got to do one kind of number. One of the best ways it's done in credit is, we all probably gone through this credit score. If you're getting a loan or a credit card, right, there's a credit score that results in a decision tree. We may not see it, but this FICO score is given, and that's what allows creditors to make decisions on what type of loan, credit card, interest, all these fun things, what you get, right? And so we started, okay, well, let's give this one number with all these forces and take into these other important factors into account. And so the decision tree we're going to go through is called a CART model, a classification and regression tree. First question in that CART model, a lot of times, is who, right? Who is it? What is it? In this case, the first question is, and this is an example from the NFL Combine where we're used as a test, is it a defensive back? A lot of times, yes goes to the right, or to the left, whichever way you look at it. And the answer is yes, this is a defensive back. The next question is that score below 86? It's not. So this time we go the other direction, down the tree. Is the score above 88? It's not. So an individual that is a defensive back that has a score between 86 and 88 has a 67% chance of being injured during the season. So that's how we take all that data and roll it up into something that's digestible and actionable using these CART models. So if we're talking about football, we have to bring up concussion. So does anybody know the gold standard for a concussion, at least in terms of proprioception or physical ability? Does anybody know the test there? Anybody?
SCAT.
SCAT, yeah. So within SCAT is what's called a BEST test, the Balance Error Scoring System. So the way they test for balancing concussion is they see how many times you touch the ground standing on one leg. I want you to think that we're sending people to the moon, and this is how we're testing for a concussion. So when we look at how reliable tests are, a lot of times there's a test-retest reliability. So we're testing every day. How similar are those results day to day? And so it'll compare them, and one means they're the exact same on different days, which never happens. The ICC is about 0.4 for the best test. Give you an idea, blood pressure is about 0.9. So for medicine, you want to at least have a 0.7 generally on that ICC, that reliability. So we tried to add big data to the test, because the test isn't wrong, it's the variables. And so how do we slip a force plate to get big data out of the same protocols, the same test? And so it's gathering sway, movement in all directions. How you move left, right, heel, toe when you're balancing, and then also how well you correct. So these squiggly lines are tracings of your movement during a balance test. That's your center of gravity. If there's more movement, that's worse, right? Because you're more unstable. You can't hold that position. So we assign it a T-score again. When we do it that way, we find a reliability of 0.8. Changes it drastically in terms of that retest reliability. The other interesting piece we found is when we dive into left versus right and compare that as an approach, the reliability is 0.3. So when we do single leg testing, a lot of times we assume that's the key factor to look at. How's my left versus how's my right? And that works exceptionally in marketing. Unfortunately, scientific papers, 0.3 won't work, let alone medical protocols. And the theory as to why the difference is less important is you can hurt this right leg, which is fantastic, one that has a 78. You can hurt that because your left leg is weak, so you rely on your right leg more. Or you can just hurt it because your right leg's weak. So it's just chicken and the egg syndrome if you don't really know why that's happening. And so what really we found is it's the absolute level that's necessary. So anything above a T-score of 48, that's what really matters. So we talk a lot about this, kind of in summary, and we'll open up for questions here. The question we get a lot with data, and particularly big data as it's increasing, where's the future, at least what we see, and at least for our company, our technology, we're trying to improve the accuracy of that diagnostic. If we're at 0.7, we want to go up to 0.8. The way to do that is we're going to grow more decisions within that tree, more robust trees. Really more nodes. But then we have to use that validation that we talked about against the training set, because that'll help prune it back. That'll limit, because what statisticians have found is there's about 15 nodes within a decision tree that are optimal. Anything more, and you're basically overcorrecting. Then the last piece is once we get these decision trees separated by sports, by genders, by ages, we can combine them from a statistical technique called force. So that's really our approach for the future. I want to open it up for